Most people imagine that Moses simply lifted a rod and the bronze serpent appeared as if by miracle, but the technical truth collapses that image in the first sentence, and a number proves it. 950 degrees C is the kind of furnace heat required to make a large bronze casting stable enough to hold shape and resist cracking, and that single number changes how we see the episode in Numbers and the craft behind it. In this presentation, you will learn how a bronze object carrying the weight of communal trauma and healing was actually manufactured, what materials and temperatures were involved, who handled the heat and the tools, and why God would command something that later looked dangerously close to idolatry. Picture exhausted infantry feeling the sting of serpents, the bitter taste of fear, and then the relief of looking up at metal shaped like their wound and being told to trust it. The people were migrants with poor food stores and no established foundries. They were not trained metallurgists, but they had hands calloused by other labors and a desperate need that forced improvisation. Moses stands at the center as both leader and instrument. God ordained the object, and Moses became the human maker, yet the physical work came from artisans whose craft was learned not in schools but at the elbow of older masters. The primary source is clear, Numbers 21, and the memory of a command echoes in later reformations recorded in Kings and in archaeological parallels that show portable cult objects turning into focal points for devotion. Prepare for heat, the roar of a furnace, the metallic tang on the tongue, and for a moral knot that makes technical description unavoidable. The social context matters as much as the metallurgy. The community had recently escaped Egypt. Many had been field laborers or tent makers. Some had experience with bronze tools and carts or household items, but none had formal foundries. Supplies were precarious. A single talent of copper would be a major investment, and tin was rare, often traded over long routes. Fuel came not from coal, but from dense charcoal made of acacia wood, scrub oak, or whatever survived the marches, and that charcoal needed to be produced in controlled earthen pits, roasted for days. The camp organized itself quickly. Aaron delegated fuel collection to groups, Miriam arranged water and cloth distribution, and Bezalel and Hur, who were practical leaders of craft oversight, trained small teams. Voices in the camp were not only of authority, they were workers' voices, and the moral pressure was palpable, because if the object failed, it would be both a technical disaster and a spiritual one. You can almost hear the scrape of files on bronze and smell smoke and resin from the acacia and taste metal on your lips when you stand near the furnace. The sound of foot-driven bellows echoes like a heartbeat, and people kept shifts to keep the heat constant. The condition of the people influenced every technical choice from the alloy composition to the size, so both engineering and ethics were braided. The central technical problem was simple to name and devilishly complex to solve. Get metal molten, pour it into a mold, and have it set without voids, cracks, or poor adhesion. Yet bronze alloys behave unpredictably at scale. Bronze melts in the neighborhood of 900 degrees to 1050 degrees, depending on copper-tin ratios and impurities. And a hollow cast made to look like a coiled serpent requires control of shrinkage and gating to avoid air pockets. The stakes were high because a miscast object would waste dozens of talents of metal and weeks of labor, and it could create a scandal where ritual efficacy was questioned and lives stood in the balance. The logistic challenge extended beyond metallurgy. You need molds, usually made of clay or sand, and molds large enough to render a serpentine body require internal cores to create hollowness while maintaining external detail. You must move molten metal safely across a camp on uneven ground and pour it quickly and smoothly while the whole assembly holds position. The problem is not only thermal, it is organizational. How to choreograph dozens of people, each doing precise tasks under heat and dust and under the theological pressure of obedience. What solved it was the intervention of named technicians and a leader who combined religious authority with pragmatic decision-making. Moses remained the juridical protagonist, but a man like Bezalel, or a composite artisan named Eleazar, emerges in the reconstruction as the technical protagonist who organizes teams, instructs procedures, and stabilizes rituals into repeatable acts.
Eleazar is the craftsman who understands alloy proportions, who reads a vein of metal like a map, and who improvises a pit furnace that can reach sustained temperatures of 950 degrees through layered charcoal beds and bellows arrays worked in shifts. He teaches apprentices how to temper cores, coat clay molds with fine sawdust and grog, and how to use gating systems that direct flow to the head, the coils, and the tail, so shrinkage becomes predictable, not fatal. Eleazar is humanized by a backstory that shaped his hands and his humility. He grew up on the edge of a Nile trading post, son of a carpenter who learned to straighten copper pins and mend ox yokes. As a teenager, he watched a caravan smith anneal bronze, and the smell of hot metal became a compass for his life. He apprenticed under a Canaanite tinsmith named Uri, where he learned to count alloys by color and sound and how to judge a pour by the hiss on the crucible. He lost a brother to a collapse in a quarry, and that loss taught him patience because speed had cost life. By the time Moses gave the command, he was not merely skilled. He was a man who believed craft could mediate the sacred and the practical. That backstory explains why he carefully documented steps, taught Miriam and Aaron how to prepare.
The cloth wrappings and why he insisted on tests before the public ritual. His childhood apprenticeship, his formative lessons in alloying, his loss, and his present reputation as a teacher made him the indispensable human bridge between the divine instruction and the community execution. Dialogue compresses instruction into human exchange, and in the key workshop scene, the exchanges are precise and iterative, showing apprenticeship and communal stress. Eleazar says we must temper the core to prevent collapse. Apprentice Eliab asks, how much tin will we add? And Eleazar answers, enough to lower the melting point, but not so much that the metal becomes brittle. Eliab replies, will the supply suffice? And Eleazar replies, not without rationing and careful skimming. Aaron interjects, what if the people panic when smoke rises? And Eleazar answers, we keep watch, we explain the process, and we test small pieces before the big pour. Eliab asks, who will pour? And Eleazar replies, I will pour with her at my side, and the rest will hold the mold steady. That exchange repeats practical commands and reassurance in 4 to 6 moves, and in each line you hear sand underfoot, the clink of measuring bowls, the low throb of the bellows. Sensory detail layers the dialogue. You feel heat on the face, you smell charcoal and copper, you taste dust, you see sparks, and you touch the coarse clay mold as hands steady it. Technically, the casting process can be summarized in reproducible stages. And here we give the core steps in a concise technical description that fits experimental replication. A crucible built of clay and grog was charged with measured copper and tin in ratios roughly 90:10 by weight, yielding a workable bronze. The crucible was heated in a pit furnace insulated with packed clay. The temperature monitored by observing the metal surface color and by test shavings. Then the molten metal was skimmed to remove dross, and a temperature window around 950 to 1000 degrees Celsius was targeted. Pour channels or gates were prepared in the mold, and the pour executed continuously to avoid cold shuts. This process element is short but exact and emphasizes practical controls necessary to make a large, complex form survive cooling. The broader production scene involved many named roles, each with precise tasks, and each name a small human story. Moses gives command and blessing. Aaron organizes the labor details. Miriam tends water and cloth and watches safety. Bezalel and Eleazar instruct and inspect molds. Hur stands by the pour as a stabilizer and baler. Eliab measures alloys and reports impurities. Joram oversees charcoal production and tests its burn density. Uri negotiates for tin and tracks stores. Each of these people acts concretely. They carry braziers full of embers, they steady wooden supports, they wet clay, they scrape metal slag, and they sing a brief chant before the public ritual to steady nerves. The camp hum is not background, it is a technical factor because coordination reduces error, and the songs time the stages so that everyone moves in rhythm. Sensory images repeat in every scene: the metallic bite in the air, the grit on the tongue, the blinking orange of furnace mouth, the dryness of hands scraped raw by rope, and the slight pain of blisters forming and later thickening into hardened skin. Along the way, there are moments of acute tension that slow the narrative and force attention. In the first moment, as the huge mold is prepared, a seam tears and a core threatens to collapse. The team scrambles, the clay dust hangs as people breathe faster, the bellows throb, and Eleazar curses softly. He directs workers to rewrap the core and to increase packing density. They work with wet cloth and fingers raw, and the clock of the ritual ticks on while molten metal grows hot and impatient in the crucible. That scene runs 5 to 7 minutes in your imagination, and it is about the friction between human haste and the metal's need for slowness, and the scene must be felt, not just described. A second moment comes at the crucible when the pour begins. Sparks fly, and a sudden draft gusts through the camp, sending a spray of hot embers toward the mold. Panic flashes in faces. Aaron covers a basket of cloth to prevent ignition, and Hur clamps the mold. Eleazar controls the flow with a trembling hand, and for a hairbreadth the pour could tilt and spill onto the ground, burning stores and people alike. The risk of death and sacrilege converge in that instant, and only disciplined procedure averts disaster. The third moment happens after the object cools and is revealed. The crowd holds its breath because the surface shows microcracks that could make the snake fragile. Priests run fingers across scales and a hush settles. Everyone questions whether the object will hold the healing power promised, or whether the whole thing will be dismissed as failure. The palpable anxiety of a community deciding whether to believe makes ritual and material inseparable. The craft details of tools and materials are indispensable to understanding why the object could behave like an idol later on. The casting required earthen box furnaces lined with clay and ashes. It required bellows made of leather and woven reeds pumped by teams of men or women. It required grooved molds built with organic cores wrapped in cloth and oiled to release it later. And it required measured alloys and skimming to avoid porosity. The acacia charcoal smoked with a resinous scent and was tested by burn density. A high-density charcoal gives hotter, sustained heat but requires more labor to produce. The bellows writher is audible and keeps the temperature stable, and the tactile knowledge of when metal is ready is something learned by many pours. These process notes, each run 250 to 350 characters, are compact and technical, and they map directly onto experimental archaeology methods published in archaeometallurgy journals for replicating Bronze Age large casts. The assembly and ceremonial unveiling completed the loop from practical to sacred. After cooling, the snake was polished, connections checked, and a staff or pole was prepared, often of acacia wood and sometimes overlaid with metal sheets to resist splitting. The object was fixed at eye height so a bitten person could see and be healed. Priests tested it, perhaps by striking small test chips or by visual inspections, and only after ritual pronouncements by Moses or priests was the object made public. In the biblical telling, the sequence validates that the object was not a spontaneous idol, but a divinely sanctioned instrument of healing. Yet the social psychology that transforms sanctioned objects into idols is visible in the subsequent history when generations later people began to burn incense to the bronze piece and it became a snare. The narrative must address this theological ambiguity because God ordained the object as remedy, but human tendencies to objectify the sacred made the serpent into an idol in time. At roughly this midpoint, it is worth pausing to engage you, the viewer, because the technical puzzle invites opinion and the moral knot invites debate. If this reconstruction already surprised you, write in the comments what element seemed least expected. Was it the metallurgy, the ingenious use of acacia charcoal, the choreography of bellows, or the fact that a leader could both command and make an object that looked dangerously like an idol? Start your answer with one of these words: metallurgy, bellows, acacia, or leadership, so I can see what caught your attention. Your comment will guide future episodes where we test specific reconstructions in the lab and perhaps recreate a scaled experimental pour to show the exact behavior of the alloy and the mold. In the final scenes, the camp moves from heat to hush, and the object is folded into ritual routine and later into memory. King's narratives and prophetic reforms record the fate of that serpent when Hezekiah orders its destruction because it had become an object of false worship, and that later reaction proves the risk of material sacred objects. Yet technical validation remains. Archaeological analogs and metallurgical analyses show that a life-sized hollow bronze form is technically feasible in a mobile context, and that small teams working with charcoal bellows and controlled molds could produce portable cult objects. The consequence is double. The artifact was effective, and it also taught the community how fragile the boundary is between instrument and idol. The legacy goes beyond a single object. It influences temple practices. Later, the move from mobile shrines to fixed stone sanctuaries reveals an institutional attempt to control sacred material and to distance worship from objects that could be deified. In closing, remember the contrast that began this story. The apparently miraculous object was also an engineered solution, demonstrating skill and sacrifice. The technical proof lies in alloy ratios, in furnace temperatures, and in the logistics of charcoal and bellows. And the human proof lies in the names and stories of Moses, Aaron, Miriam, Eleazar, Hur, Eliab, Joram, and Uri, who together turned divine command into a lasting physical act. The object fulfilled its function, and yet it also issued a warning about the human tendency to revere the tangible over the transcendent. If you want to see a laboratory reenactment where modern metallurgists and experimental archaeologists pour a scaled bronze serpent with period techniques, subscribe and turn on notifications because the next video will attempt precisely that and will show tests, scans, and interviews with specialists. The bronze serpent is therefore both a story of metal and people, of holiness and of hazard, and it leaves us with a final image to hold. Heat-melted metal and human hands shaped a symbol that healed and later tempted worship, and in that tension we find the full meaning of why the divine could ordain something so technically precise and yet so theologically vulnerable.